All right, and in addition to being a place of tranquility, forest streams are a vital resource, and forest owners work hard to keep them clean and healthy for those further down in the watershed. Our next presentation is a summary of the Oregon State University's Institute of Natural Resources science-based review of the effects of forest management on drinking water. Our speaker is the lead investigator on the review, John Souter. John Souter is an assistant professor and forest watershed extension specialist in OSU's College of Forestry. John is also the director of the Watershed Research Cooperative. From 2000 until joining OSU, he was the executive director of the Coos Watershed Association in Charleston, Oregon, managing their water quality assessment, restoration, and monitoring programs. He has a PhD and a Master's of Science in Wildland Resources Science from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BS in Biology from Marlborough College in Vermont.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for that introduction. I should probably correct the fact that the Watershed Research Cooperative concluded in 2018 with the completion of the field work for the ALSI Revisited and Hinkle paired watershed studies. But a lot of the work and the research and data that was collected for those studies, including the Hinkle paired watershed study, is still being analyzed, and publications are coming out, on practically a monthly basis for that. And I'm happy to talk with folks about that. A lot of that research from the Watershed Research Cooperative went into the Trees to Tap report that I'm going to talk about this morning with you all. I think most of us who own forest or help manage forest understand the value of the water that's coming from those forests. The Oregon Forest Resources Institute, periodically does these surveys, public opinion surveys of residents of Oregon, and perennially they find that water quality is the top concern about the public with respect to active forest management. And so in 2018, OFRI came to Anthony Davis, who was at that time the interim dean of the College of Forestry, and asked him to put together a team of people to update some work that had last been done in 2000 on how active forest management affects source drinking water quality. And by source drinking water quality, I mean the water that basically goes into the intakes of community water supplies or public water supplies. And in many cases, a number of you are probably relying on surface water for your own household water supplies. And through that project, and Anthony Davis approached me to lead that study. And we put together a very broad-based steering committee for a 10-person steering committee that had representatives of most of the state and federal agencies that are involved in forest management and environmental regulation. And the steering committee identified 4 topics that they wanted us to look at. The first was and these are in priority order that they said. The first was, what effect does active forest management have on changes in water quantity and the timing of water? The second was effects of active forest management on sediment and turbidity, and that's something I think that most managers are fairly familiar with. Clearly, forest chemicals and particularly herbicide applications are commonly highlighted in the news if you read the paper and papers about that. And then finally, there was a 4th item that I wasn't all that familiar with, which is the relationship between natural organic matter in a stream, and that's typically carbon-based, things like the tannins, as well as the detritus, the coarser particles. What effect does that have when that enters the treatment plant and then comes in contact with chlorine, and that creates what are called disinfectant byproducts, and a number of those disinfectant byproducts are considered carcinogenic. So we were asked to evaluate the science, current science on these 4 topics in the context of active forest management. And by active forest management, we identified logging certainly as an action, but also forest roads and then revegetation. And so most of these 4 topics were all evaluated in the context of those different types of management actions. So we started that study in 2018, and the work on it, or the primary work on it, and the final report went to OFRI in June of 2020. And since that time, I've been working on editing the report and the chapters that came out of that report. And it's about to be published as a book by Oregon State University Extension Communications that will be available free for downloads or purchase as a hard copy. And I'm sure it will make a great Christmas present, birthday present, raffle ticket giveaway, things like that for everybody. OFRI has all of the results of the study on their website, oregonforest.org/trees to tap. They also did a special kind of higher level general public out-facing report called Keeping Drinking Water Safe. That's a summary, higher level summary of the report, and also includes some interviews with forest managers and landowners and community water supplies for it. So, and it's about 26 pages. It's a lot more accessible than the 300-page book for most folks. As I mentioned, there's the book coming out from OSU Extension, and a number of you may have participated in the virtual Trees to Tap conference that we had last March. But if you didn't get a chance to participate in that, or you want to review what went on in the conference, those videos of those sessions are all available also on the Trees to Tap site. So what I want to do in the time that I've got now is to just do a high-level overview of what we found in that study, and particularly focusing on areas that I think are of interest to small woodland owners, tree farmers, and that. So first, I want to give some kind of general caveats to that we identified in the report to making connections between active forest management and drinking water quality. First is that the size of the drainage or the contributing area that's going into a raw water intake really matters for it. So in this photos here, we've got Oceanside, small coastal community, rain-fed, has a very small contributing area or watershed area above their intake. In contrast, Sweet Home on the South Santiam River has over 500, almost 600 square mile source watershed for their areas. So you can see that types of forest management activities are going to affect that raw water quality and quantity quite differently between those two sizes. Geography is also important. The primary geographic effect is whether the precipitation system is rainfall or whether it's snow-based. And if it's rainfall, those of us who live on the coast know that you're getting a lot of rain in the winter and it's drier in the summer. Whereas if you're in a snow-fed system, the snow is accumulating over the course of a winter and then gradually melting over through into the even into the early summer for that. Geology is also important. Again, those of us on the coast who are in the tiny sandstone, that geology, groundwater or water moves through the ground quite a bit differently compared to the basalt systems that are more representative in the Cascades that are more highly fractured, and the water moves through those fractures much more quickly. Land ownership, land management intensity varies greatly between owners, from the federal government that has, in many cases and for much of their land, more of a custodial approach to management versus an industrial timber operation that is moving towards 30, 35-year old rotations on it. And so the pace of activities and the pace of management varies greatly depending on who owns it and who manages it. And then finally, the mix of land ownerships is also important for it. Again, if you look at this example here, you've got Oceanside, Short Creek, entirely private industrially owned operation with no intervening land uses between forestry and the raw water intake right near the coast there in that photo. And in contrast, you've got Sweet Home that has, of course, national forest land. Above it has a number of reservoirs intervening between the forest land and the raw water intake. And then in the lower areas closest to the raw water intake, you've got some urban, rural, residential, and agricultural properties. And so those patterns of management activities in these other land uses that are intervening between the forest and the raw water intake really may have as significant or more significant effects on the quality of the water that's coming into the system than the forest land uses up higher for it. And so one of the things that we did learn and was identified in the science that we were reviewing is that this extrapolating from smaller watersheds and particularly upper watershed areas where most of the research has been done, on forestry research has been done, is very hazardous to try and extrapolate that to these larger areas and particularly ones that are further downstream. So with those caveats in mind, I want to walk through quickly those four major areas that we were asked to evaluate. So the first one is effects of active forest management on water quantity and water timing. And for those of you who have had Forest Hydrology 101, it's probably, if you remember back that far, when you cut trees, you cause a number of different hydrologic effects. So the first one is that you don't have that evapotranspiration that was previously there, where the needles are basically water is evaporating from the needles and going up into the air, and it's drawing water from the ground as well as intercepting water from the rainfall in there. And so, you know, when the trees are growing, you've got that loss of water that's not entering the streams as a result of that. You cut the trees, you decrease that evapotranspiration, and I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that once you harvest an area, then suddenly you may be seeing a lot of springs that you never saw before. And that's largely because of this combination effect of the lack of evapotranspiration and the lack of precipitation being intercepted by the canopy of the trees. And then snow has some different effects as well. Depending on the pattern of harvest, you may have greater snow accumulation, again, on the ground, and that's subsequently going to melt and go into the streams, compared to when that snow hits the canopy and stays on the canopy. A lot of that called sublimation evaporates directly from the canopy and never reaches the stream for that. And again, the caveat that most of the research has been done in smaller basins, and you have to be careful about extrapolating that to the larger basins that may be in the community water supply watersheds. So one of the things I mentioned, the Watershed Research Cooperative, and one of the studies, the ALSI Revisited study, was unique in that there was an original ALSI paired watershed study that went from 1958 to 1973. And that was really one of the original efforts to understand the effects, at least of 1960s era forest practices for it. But what was unique is that whole cycle went through, ended in 1973, And then that area, the treated area for there called Needle Branch Creek was replanted, grew, similarly to, pretty much every other area that's harvested and replanted and grows again. But then it was ready for harvest again in the 20 teens or so. And so a group, primarily National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, George Ice and his group, wanted to restart that study to look at the effects of contemporary forest practices on second growth forests and what effects those had on watershed processes. So we have this comparison between the early 1960s era style effects where an area was rotted, and the old growth was harvested, compared to the contemporary management practices on a second growth forest with buffers as required by the Forest Practice Act. And Catalina Segura and a group in the Forest Engineering Department at OSU evaluated the streamflow data for this, looking at the original streamflow effects from the original study and the effects from the contemporary studies. And one of the big concerns that's emerging that you may have heard about is the effect that fast-growing young plantations have on taking up water because they're growing faster and they're transpiring a lot for it. And so one of the focuses for this journal article that she wrote was basically on the effects on what's called the summer low flow deficits for it. And so the table here, we've got, I'll walk through what she learned and the group learned through that. So the focus was really on the summer period for it, because that's most critical for a lot of aquatic life when you have lower flows and warmer water in the summer. And so what she saw from the original ALSI study that was that after the harvest in the Needle Branch, you have increased flows in the winter. And again, that's the result of lack of interception primarily. And you have some increased flows in the beginning of the summer. Again, that's probably the loss of evapotranspiration for it. And then you have some subtle deficits in the later summer, beginning of the fall. And so the way to interpret this data and these figures is that this zero line is the reference watershed. That was Flynn Creek. That's old growth. Was old growth, still old growth in there. It's a research natural area of the Forest Service. And so this is what, and so anything above this zero dark black line here means that you have increased flows in the treated area, Needle Branch Creek, compared to Flynn Creek for it. And if you have areas below that, meaning that you have less water in the actively managed unit compared to the reference area in Flynn Creek. So this was the pattern in the initial study, 1967 to 73 in there. And then part of this process with these paired watershed studies is that you have what's called a calibration period before a treatment is entered, and that calibration period is typically 6 years. So you look at it 6 years before treatment, you do the treatment, then you study it for 6 years afterwards. What we were able to see in as that process went through with the second treatment, and this is that line, purple line here is the second treatment for it. And this is this is the plantation that's 43 years old that regrew after the initial harvest in there. And so one of the key parts of this is that the summer low flow deficit is quite a bit more significant in these young, fast growing plantations there. And you have about 36% deficit through the summer kind of critical low flow period with that. And you still have, and you can see that you have some interception also lower flows in the winter, which is less critical for aquatic life. And that deficit in the winter, in comparison to an old growth area, really is the interception, most likely the interception by the canopy of rainfall, because this is one of the rainfall systems in there. Okay, so then, so this was pre-second harvest here. If you go to the initial post-harvest for it, again, you see a pattern that pretty much mirrors what the original harvest was for it. And any differences kind of between those two are most likely related to differences in the moisture regimes, which are the El Nino, La Nina effect for it that changes from one period to the other period. But again, you're seeing some of these slight increases compared to the reference site in the winter and spring. And then you've got these same deficits in the summer as well for it. And then if you look at the post-harvest era, this thicker orange line here, you can see that that's going back again and tending to replicate what we saw in the fast-growing young plantations. So it's pretty clear from this study, as well as some other studies that have been done in Oregon, is that if you harvest and you do a clear cut system particularly, then as those plantations grow back, they're going to use more water. And as a result of them using more water, intercepting and evaporating more water, you are going to have lower flows in the summer compared to a system that was not managed for it. And that's about 36% difference there. Okay, so that's the water quantity story. There's some timing stories as well with it, but most of the emphasis, I think, and most of the focus is going to be on these summer low flow deficits. Okay, so let's see if I can get more. So the next area that we looked at was sediment and turbidity. And this is something that also was highlighted in the original ALSE paired watershed study, where the area was harvested and then had a very hot burn for all of the slash from that. But it's interesting, one of the outcomes of that original ALSE study was the requirement for buffers along streams. And so there was an interesting study that was done fairly recently by Rachel in 2018 for her master's thesis, and then a journal article for it that looked at the mobilization of sediment as after harvest activities and where that ended up on the landscape. And they measured that essentially by putting silt fences in on the unit that was harvested. And be aware that this axis on the amount of sediment collected is a logarithmic scale here. So these larger lines are orders of magnitude differences from it. So so while you're looking at the boxes and you may be saying, well, that's not such a great difference, but if you look at the scale on it, there are some significant differences between it. So what she was finding was that there were about 19.3 grams per square meter of sediment mobilized on the logged unit for that. And the forested buffer, or the harvest, the edge between the harvest and the buffer, was accumulating a lot of that sediment from it. And the amount that was actually ending up in the stream, in the buffer next to the stream, was relatively low compared to that. So one of the findings is that these buffers, one of the services that these riparian management areas or buffers provide is effectively to catch a lot of that sediment that may be coming off of the harvest unit before it reaches the stream. Again, geology matters, slope matters, things like that are likely to change that relative relationship for it. But nonetheless, it does seem like one of the services that these riparian buffer areas serve very effectively is to intercept sediment. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the other effects of them. One of the other things that's pretty clear from the literature is that if you're in a steep landslide prone area for it, and again, particularly in the Thai sandstone region, you are going to see an increased amount of landslides after a harvest. And that's happening because after you harvest an area, the growing trees there have a network of roots in them that's holding the soil in place. After you harvest that area, the roots start to break down and deteriorate. And so you lose not only that strength, but also what happens is you then create a whole number of channels going down into the soil where those roots have deteriorated. And that allows water to build up in those, and the weight of that water effectively overcomes the resistance of the soil to sliding. So that's fairly clear. Can be anywhere from 2 to 10 times the magnitude that would have been there in the absence of harvest. That's not to say that you don't see any landslides in what are called in-unit landslides. Those happen as well. It's just an increased potential for it as a result of harvest. Okay, and then the second piece, and really an area that I've done a lot of work and a lot of research has been done, is the relationship between roads and sediment. And at this point, in terms of forest practices, roads are the most likely cause for increased sedimentation in streams. And we do know that through a number of studies that the types of best management practices in the Forest Practice Act and in the guides that ODF provides are effective in reducing or practically eliminating those road-related sediment inputs. And the sediment is really related to a couple things. One is if culverts are undersized and they get blocked during storms, they're more likely to either blow out the fill for it, or the stream is likely to divert down the road and erode the road prism from it. The second piece that's important is the durability or the quality of the gravel or aggregate that you put on the road, because particularly under heavy hauling characteristics, that aggregate or gravel can break down quite rapidly and potentially go into streams. And the key there is whether that road surface is what's called hydrologically connected to the stream, or whether you have it isolated so it runs off into buffer areas and catches the sediment. And again, the best management practices are effective in reducing or pretty much eliminating this source of sediment. Okay, so moving on to everybody's favorite topic of forest herbicides and spraying. So one of the things that I did, one of my roles in this whole project was to go through the ODF notifications that were archived in the Ferns system for it. And I looked at about 400,000 notifications in this, and there were a large number of them, not surprisingly, are chemical applications for it. And so one of the things I found looking at 4 years of these notifications is that there were about 7,000 notifications per year covering about 1 million acres that were involved some sort of spray activity. And it's difficult to tell because not every activity that's notified is actually conducted. So there's some challenges with working that data, but I think that that's probably a reasonable estimate of the amount of herbicide applications that are occurring, around 1 million acres a year. And then another about 125,000 acres a year are fertilizer applications. But what's interesting when you start really thinking about how chemicals are used in forestry is the fact that on any given piece of ground, there's a cycle of when, and again, this is assuming even age management, but there's a cycle of when these applications are going to occur. So you may have a first application that's even pre-harvest with it if the forester thinks that there's going to be vegetation that's currently suppressed under the canopy of things like maple, in particular, in there that's likely to be released from the harvest and then become a problem for the revegetation. They may go through the unit even prior to the harvest and do a hack and squirt to control that vegetation as kind of the pre-harvest site preparation for reforestation. There's likely a second site preparation that will be a broadcast spray 1 year to 2 to 5 years after the harvest for it. So there'll be a site preparation, then there'll be the planting, and then there may be 1 or 2 release spray events after the planting occurs. And that's really it in terms of the herbicide applications for at least, depending on what the rotation age is, but for probably at least 35 years. And then some owners in some areas of the state are actively fertilized. And that fertilization typically comes after either a pre-commercial thin or a commercial thin. And so that's typically an either or. You're quite unlikely to have 2 fertilization applications for that. So what did we find in the effects of that? So, and the impact of this really depends on your perspective about herbicides for it. So we know from the public, and you've probably heard it too, that there are concerns about spray drift, particularly when that drift goes off the property and ends up in somebody else's property or somebody's yard for that. We're concerned about drift that may come in and drift over a buffer area and get into the water for it. There's also concern about overland flow. It sprays and then at some point it rains, and how much of that stuff just moves with that water that's coming. And that can, it's unlikely that it's going to go on the top of the soil because we don't typically have that much surface flow after rains in our soils. But there is concern about does that go through the soil and ultimately get into the streams for that. So there's very few studies for it. We really only had 3 studies that we found, kind of scientific research-based studies that were done in the Pacific Northwest. But there were some general patterns for that. And one is that there is drift in streams. You can see after a spray, and these were aerial helicopter aerial applications. You could see increases in herbicides getting into streams for it. That typically seems to be in the non-forested riparian buffers in non-fish streams where there isn't a requirement for a forested buffer. So we did see that in terms of either overspray where it wasn't recognized that there was actually live water in a unit and that got sprayed, or conversely, there was a buffer area, but due to the winds, it drifted in there. So that was during the application. And then there's also spray typically seen in the context of the first few storms in the winter that are washing some stuff in. So depending on your perspective on herbicides, this is, either these concentrations are quite low and most of the chemicals that are used in forestry break down fairly rapidly for it, and then they dissipate rapidly as they go down the stream. So if you see herbicides as an effective tool, management tool, you may think that that's an acceptable risk and acceptable amount, because these are typically what we're seeing in terms of concentrations are in the billions of parts per million for it. If you don't like herbicides, then you're probably saying, any amount is too much for it. So from the work that we did with community water suppliers, we do know that those water system managers are concerned about chemicals coming into their streams. Again, think about intervening land uses mixed with it. From what we know, and this is really beginning to be dated information from the pesticide use reporting system, but we know that only, at the time, and this was the about the 1909 to 1911 period when that data was collected, we know that only about 3.5% of the chemicals used in Oregon are applied to forest land, which means that 96.5% are going into these other land uses. But we also know, as this table shows on the right, that we're finding detectable concentrations of these chemicals used in forestry, as well as in other uses in streams for it. And glyphosate, the poster child for herbicides, seems to be the most prevalent one that's found for it. It's also clear from the research some of the research that was done west of Corvallis on drift, as well as a larger body of evidence from the agricultural community in terms of drift, that buffers need to be forested to be effective at avoiding drift into streams for that. We also found that most of the research that's been done, both during the registration process for chemicals, as well as research that's been done in the application side of it, is looking at the single chemical and typically the active ingredient for the chemical. And we don't know a lot about what these multiple mixes, colloquially called tank mixes, where you may have 2 or 3 active ingredients mixed in there, along with a number of surfactants and other types of adjuvants. So we don't really know what the effect of that is for it. And we're not doing enough monitoring to really know, to give me at least a lot of comfort that we know how this is working in forestry. So then finally, I'll quickly go through these final couple of areas. So the natural organic matter, that's something that is natural by name. These are leaves going into the streams, detritus, the runoff through the surface, litter, decomposition of large wood, both in the units and along the streams. So that's all contributing organic matter to the stream, as is the primary productivity within the stream itself for that. Different types of forest management activities have different effects on the amount of organic matter that's entering the stream for it. And particularly, there's a couple of sources that, again, that it's not really clear what the pattern is, but fires can either use up a lot of that natural organic matter that's going into the stream because it's combusting it and it's going up into the air, or the increased runoff that's coming after a fire can also increase that in the stream. So doesn't seem to me to be a clear pattern for it, but that pattern can persist for some time afterwards. Again, where we've got these big areas of bark beetle infestation, where you've got large areas of dead trees in there and they're falling down, that does tend to increase the natural organic matter in the stream for it. So where we're concerned about with that is not that that's a bad thing, because carbon is the building block for the foundation of all of life. But where that's a concern is if that natural organic matter doesn't get filtered out or through the treatment process and then comes in contact with chlorine that's required by the Safe Drinking Water Act to disinfect water. And there's a requirement in these water systems that there be a residual of chlorine all the way to when it comes out into the tap, into your faucet for it. And the problem becomes where you've got a lot of these areas where the water isn't actively cycled through for it. So the length of time that the chlorine is in contact with the natural organic matter in the treated water affects the development of these disinfectant byproducts. And so where we're seeing violations of water quality standards for these disinfectant byproducts typically are at the end of lines, water supply lines where not much is, there's not much flow of water through there. So that's not a forestry effect, that's more of a treatment and management system effect for it. Okay, and then not surprisingly, while fire was not a huge focus for our original study, and our steering committee had it prioritized fairly low down, in today's world, fire is a primary concern. One of the things that we were able to do as an add-on to this project was to get a U.S. Forest Service group to put together some fire risk models. So what they essentially converted some programs that they had that looked at fire risk for communities, and instead we looked at fire risk for the water supply, watersheds for it. With it. And again, we're looking at where fires develop and where they move to, and the severity of the potential burns from it. And typically, the people who have the most sources of fire are the people who have the greatest land ownership. And so if you're in the Cascades, that's the Forest Service. But if you're in the Coast Range, that's private industry for it. But what we're using these models for are in an atlas that's going to be provided to all of the community water suppliers, systems, and then hopefully they're going to be using that information to work with the owners of where these fires are coming from to try and reduce the likely effects of them. Okay, so in general, what we found from this, and again, this is I don't see it as controversial, but it can be. I think it's pretty clear, and I think the data is pretty clear, that the highest quality raw water is coming from forested watersheds for it. That doesn't mean that there aren't effects of forestry on water quality that can be addressed both through management actions and potentially through regulation. One of the things, and this is the academic in me, always identifies that we need more research for this. And I said in the beginning on the caveats for it, it's very hazardous to try and extrapolate from these very small areas where studies are done to much larger watersheds. So we do need to do some additional research looking at these much larger watersheds and understanding these upstream and downstream connections between them. For sediment and turbidity, again, roads. Fix roads and you probably fixed 85 or 90% of the problem for it, and we know how to do that for it. And then finally, with the forest chemicals, we as a forestry profession and as forest managers really need to make some additional investments in modeling and understanding how these chemicals work, because we have a social license to use forest chemicals in active forest management. And if we can't demonstrate that they're safe, it's going to lead to additional restrictions on their use for it. So want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk with you about this. Again, please feel free to contact me if you want about this study or other watershed related forest management issues. You can find all of the materials from the Trees to Tap report on the OFRI website, oregonforest.org/trees to tap. So I don't know, Lauren, if you're getting any questions for this, but I'd be happy to answer if we've got time.
Thanks, John. That was a very good summary of all the current research around water. Wonderful. And, great to be able to have a resource to look back to. We don't, you did a perfect job, John, because we don't have any questions related to your talk. But if anybody would like to write a question in now, that would be great. We are coming up to our Oregon Small Woodlands Association business meeting. And so maybe John can stick around and answer them in writing, and then you guys can check the answered section of the Q&A bar for those questions. So please, any questions you have related to water, get those in the Q&A box, and John will get those answered for you. Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Lauren.